Today's video is a bit topical. Every September since 1994, England has been involved in the Heritage Open Days scheme, and it's happening again this year in 2021. In 2020, some changes had to happen, of course. Many events went online for obvious reasons, and this year there's a combination of online and live things taking place. Every year there seems to be a theme for these Heritage Open Days, and this year's is Edible England. As a family historian, I have often researched people who had some link or other to food production or food retail. I've certainly got ancestors who were involved in food production, whether they were farmers, perhaps they were innkeepers, shopkeepers, that kind of profession. Today I thought I would look at something a bit closer to home. I'm going to investigate evidence of food retailers in my hometown of Clitheroe in Lancashire from the Regency period to the early Victorian years, using some original resources that anybody can access if they know where to look to research family and local history. Trade directories are some of my absolute favourite resources. You can find everything in trade directories. Population statistics, interesting and notable facts about a town and its history. You might find mentions of canals and early railway lines going through, even down to the year, month when they opened. The number of churches, the different denominations that were catered for, all sorts of local trivia, essentially. Usually there will also be, which is much more useful to the family historian, a list of shopkeepers, traders, often also members of the local gentry, the better off in society. Bain's History, Directory and Gazetteer of the County Palatine of Lancaster, Volume 1, wonderful long title there, published in 1824, tells us that in the year 1801, which is when a census was taken, these census records aren't generally available on the genealogy sites, but the censuses were being taken every 10 years from 1801 onwards in England and Wales. There were 1,368 people living in Clitheroe. A generation earlier, in 1791, the Universal British Directory notes a handful of people who were selling food and also drink in Clitheroe. These included Mrs. Holdren, a widow, Thomas Harris and Thomas Warner. They were all grocers. Thomas Holt was the innkeeper of the Black Bull. T. Hyde was innkeeper of the Old King's Head, and John Wilson was the innkeeper of the Swan, which I suspect is the one that we probably call the Swan and Royal today. There may also have been other traders who aren't mentioned. In my experience, trade directories are not a comprehensive list of every business person in a town, or indeed every person who has employment. You are certainly not going to get detailed lists of everybody who works in, say, a textile factory. Clitheroe had many textile factories springing up at this point. But my impression was that people may have actually paid to have their information included in these directories. I think it was a little bit like advertising, effectively. And of course not everybody could afford that. Some people would have just about been making ends meet, so the fact that somebody's in a trade directory in itself is probably telling you they've got a little bit of cash to burn on advertising. Now let us move on to a more unusual resource. I do like a good land tax assessment. But if you haven't heard of them, you're going to wonder what they are, aren't you? Not everybody is familiar with these things. Generally, land tax assessments, certainly the ones that are held at the Lancashire Archives, cover the years 1781 to 1831. They are a list that was taken every year, so in theory there should be around 50 lists, but coverage can be a bit patchy. Often there are periods where a whole 100, as groups of towns and villages were called, were not included or haven't survived. Perhaps they were destroyed for some reason. Where they do survive, a land tax assessment can be a great resource if you're trying to trace your ancestors before the 1841 census. The last year that they were compiled was 1831. Typically they are organised by town. There is a separate list created for every single year. So you would start off, say, with 1781, then you move on to 1782, you probably see a few duplicates, and you move on successively, but you can pick out gradual changes, hints that people may have died, or the property or premises or shop may have been taken over by somebody else. Sometimes street names will be included, but not always. They will also tell you the name of the landowner, the name of the tenant. People didn't often own their own property that they lived on. It will tell you how much tax is due. Typically it was 4 shillings in the pound, so that's 20%. Sometimes it will also mention what the property was used for. It might be a house, it might be a shop, a warehouse, barn, it might be pasture in agricultural areas. All these possibilities are there. In Clitheroe's case, the early assessments are a bit haphazard. Not many landowners are actually named, but unusually people's occupations are. This is not a typical thing for land tax assessments to include. So actually when we look at this extract from the 1802 assessment, we see some familiar names that were mentioned in the trade directories. We'll also note a couple of new ones. So we can combine this information with the details from the 1791 Trade Directory. We can guess that Mrs. Haldren was probably Isabella Haldren, and her burial record can be found in the registers for the parish church St Mary Magdalene's, and this tells us, so we're bringing in a third resource here, that Isabella must have been around about 61 years old in 1802. So even before the census years, there are lots of ways that you can combine resources to understand more about, in this particular case, the food retailers in a particular town, in Clitheroe. But when I looked at the land tax assessment, I noticed another interesting name, our Mr. Kirkpatrick. We are told that he is a draper and a tea dealer. So can we find out more about Mr. Kirkpatrick? To answer that, we need to turn back to our faithful Mr. Baines and his 1824 directory. It's not a bad thing to look at this Baines directory, because of course it is almost exactly 200 years old. Not quite, but close enough. And Baines tells us that just under 2 centuries ago there were 40 traders in Clitheroe who were making or selling food. As a researcher, I do think that the information he supplies is something of an improvement on the Universal British Directory of 33 years earlier. This time it gives us 3 pieces of information about each person. We get a name, we get a rank or occupation depending on whether they work for a living or whether they are gentry, and we also get a street address, which again is a useful cross-reference. There were 4 bakers, 8 butchers, and a colossal 28 people classed as grocers, tea and flour dealers, so I suppose they're basically like small shopkeepers. But Joseph Kirkpatrick, who we know was a tea dealer according to the land tax records, was not listed amongst the tea dealers in Baines' Directory. Was he still alive? Yes, he was. And he'd actually moved on to something else, which I think may possibly have been a bit more lucrative, perhaps. So here we are now, approaching the end of the 1820s. So we're not too far away from the time when the 1841 census will be taken, at which point it gets a lot easier to trace ancestors or anybody really using online records. The census records are pretty generally available online using the family history website of your choice. There are several well-known ones around. I think I've probably used most of them myself. If we know from that Joseph Kirkpatrick was living on Church Street in Clitheroe in 1824, could I use my resources at my fingertips to find out whether he was still in Clitheroe in 1841? Is he on the census? Or maybe he could be on the census in 1851. If that's the case, the returns may actually tell us when and where he was born. That's the great thing about the 1851 census. It gives birthplaces for the first time. Actually, yes, he certainly was. When I looked him up, I found Joseph Kirkpatrick living in Clitheroe in 1851. He was originally from Ray, which is right at the top of the Forest of Bowland, about 6 miles northeast of Lancaster. So, it's the other side of the Forest of Bowland from Clitheroe, really. And by 1851, we've already had a bit of a hint of this in Baines' Directory, he is calling himself a retired brandy dealer. He's still living on Church Street, so we can be pretty sure he's the right man, with his wife Jane. From that, I was able to create a family tree. This is what I think Joseph's extended family may have looked like. Joseph Kirkpatrick was buried at St Mary Magdalene's Church in Clitheroe on the 1st of February 1855. His son Richard Edelston Kirkpatrick went on to become an overlooker in a cotton mill. There was a lot of textile work going on in Clitheroe by the mid-19th century, but that does seem to bring an end to the Kirkpatrick family's link to food retail. But it does lead me neatly on to the story of another trader. This one catered for people with a particularly sweet tooth. Another resource which I often turn to whenever I'm doing research into early Victorian Lancashire is Malexs Directory of Mid-Lancashire for 1854. It seems to cover just about everywhere. It says Mid-Lancashire. I think pretty much the whole county may actually be included in there. Mr. Malexs decided to split the food traders of Clitheroe into various different categories: bakers, butchers, corn dealers, grocers, and tea dealers, beer houses, other tea dealers, wine and spirit merchants. There's a whole lot of different categories there. So, but of course, food shops, as we know, especially specialist food shops, can branch off into very specific directions even today. So it's not surprising that some people did want to specialise. There was a miscellaneous list at the beginning of the Clitheroe section, which included people that didn't really fit into one category or another in the remainder of the Clitheroe directory. And this miscellaneous list includes people who did actually sell or make food, 3 fruiterers, and 1 confectioner. Eleanor Burnett from Castle Street. And actually Eleanor was mentioned in Malexs Directory twice. Not only is she listed as a confectioner, she also comes up in the section on bakers too, so that probably gives us quite a good idea of the kind of thing she was doing to earn a living. From what I can establish, Eleanor was certainly in Clitheroe 13 years earlier when the 1841 census was taken. So let's see what that tells us. Again, this is where it helps to bring different resources together, where Malexs is only telling us Eleanor's occupation and her name, of course, and her address. The census will tell us who she lived with at that address, although of course in 1841 you don't get the relationships, but you do get an idea of who was who in the household. From the census we can work out that she appears to be a married woman. She appears to have had 3 children with her husband. But the next stage obviously was to find something to confirm those relationships, because the problem with the 1841 census is it doesn't actually specify how people are related to each other in the household. So I've only actually been able to find baptisms for Ellen and Mary, so they are the 2 confirmed children that Eleanor had. But this Jane would have been born when Eleanor was about 48 years old, so I would say it's quite debatable as to whether or not they're mother and daughter. It's possible, but it's on the outer edges of possibility, I would say. I feel as though Jane's parentage may have another explanation. And I was more convinced of this when I actually started to look further into who was who in the Burnett family tree, because something that stood out a mile was the fact that Eleanor was about 10 years younger than her husband. So I move on to the next logical step. If William Burnett is so much older than Eleanor, is there a possibility that he's been married before? It appears that there was a distinct possibility that he was married before, but I cannot find any evidence that any of William's elder 4 children had a daughter called Jane. This is applying to the sons as well as to the daughters. Jane could have easily been an illegitimate daughter of one of the daughters. She may have just been mistakenly recorded under an incorrect surname. Often they put one surname and then just ditto marks. So you've got to take them with a pinch of salt. Bearing in mind that Eleanor was living in a time when there is no old age pension, no state pension at all really. And it was not uncommon therefore to see people working into their 70s or even their 80s. Essentially I think as long as you could work, people continued to work. I have actually come across a case talking about a 103-year-old midwife Whether she was still practising at the time of her death, I'm not sure, but the fact is that people could, and often did, have to work well past what we would call retirement age in 2021. And in fact, amongst these people was, of course, Eleanor's own husband, William. We see that he is in his 70s and he's still working as a gardener, which is going to require quite a bit of physical labour, I would think. People having to do very active work often because they need an income. Which raises the question, did Eleanor Burnet ever retire? Was she able to retire? I'm not actually convinced that she did. By 1861, when Eleanor claimed to be 76 years old, and very possibly may have been, she was still living on Castle Street, working as a confectioner. Her daughter Ellen, who was 34, and her daughter Mary, aged 31, were still with her. Ellen was also a confectioner, following in her mother's footsteps, while Mary was a milliner. To give you an idea of how long Eleanor continued working, I will now tell you that just over a year later, a year after the census was taken, Eleanor Burnet died. Her burial and her age and her address are recorded in the registers for St Mary Magdalene's Church. I could probably have looked into dozens of other stories about food retailers and traders and producers in Clitheroe in the pre-1900 period just by following up the information that I've found in various Lancashire trade directories and also the Lancashire Archives online catalogue. That has a lot of information about things like wills, people taking out leases, and often you will find their occupation is listed. For simplicity's sake, I thought it was easier to stick to the approximate 1790 to 1860 period. I suppose that would be a typical lifetime for somebody born in 1791. I hope that, as well as exploring the lives behind the names of some of those people listed in those trade directories, it sort of brings it to life a bit and combines a single name with other resources that also contain that name to show how you can piece the information together to build up a bit of a story about each person. In addition to that, I hope that this video has also given you an idea of how you can use some of these unusual resources to research family or even local history, to get a sense of a Lancashire town as it once was, and to learn about the typical information that you might turn to if you are trying to research your ancestors before the 1841 census. I will put links to some of the resources that I've referenced in the description box below, but I thought to actually finish this off with a view that has a connection to Eleanor Burnet. When I looked for her on the 1861 census, I saw that she lived on Castle Street. 2 doors away was the Swan Hotel, the Swan and Royal as we call it today. Although the buildings and the paintwork may have changed a little bit in 160 years, I suspect that Eleanor may possibly have been familiar with the view that I have chosen to end this video with. I hope that this was something a bit interesting and different, and I hope it will serve as a little contribution to the 2021 Heritage Open Days week. So I've certainly enjoyed putting it together, so I hope you've enjoyed listening to it too.